The Nerf Rival Helios has guts, and I'm going to prove it. So we've got a bunch of screws on the outside shell I'm going to take out first. What scares me a little bit about this is that there's going to be a bunch of extra springs inside which is just going to leap out at me when I take this off, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the first piece to come off is this top panel, then we can get a look inside and have a little look at the mechanism. That is humongous, it's very large, you can see where it gets its power from. There we have the mag release. Hoping that the entire mechanism lifts out. And here we have that beefy spring that pulls the priming mechanism back forward once you pulled it backwards. I was beginning to think for a moment there that this hole wouldn't be big enough to get the end of that plunger head through, but it came out just fine in the end. Just needed a bit of a jiggle. This is an incredibly respectable spring, and bearing in mind what we know about the cheese grade quality of the gears on Rival blasters, I am not going to be replacing it with anything bigger. Personally, you can feel free to try it, but it's probably not advisable. I still can't get over the size of this plunger head, it's massive. Now moving on to the rest of the blaster, the handle is connected to all of these kind of bracket areas within the blaster itself. I imagine that this just pops off. Yep, there we go. I have to be a little bit cautious about this because this piece of plastic here, this piece of orange plastic actually looks quite flimsy. Right, there we go. And now it's actually not looking too dissimilar to the way a hammer shot works, the way the spring pulls the priming handle back into its position. Really beefy feeling catch spring back here. So having looked at the rest of the blaster, here are a few features. This piece here on the spring, which I'm just showing you now from the top, don't know if you can quite see that, but just down there. When the blaster is primed, that ratchets backwards, and when you kind of hear that clicking sound, it's the sound of that little orange thing ratcheting. And you can see that when you've gone back a certain distance, this orange piece here ratchets back and prevents it from sliding backwards without being primed all the way. And you can just make out there the spring which holds the priming bar in place. I'm going to be honest with you, this hasn't been the big kind of exploding mess that I expected it to be, which is nice. That's the first thing that's kind of flown out. And it's big enough to find, which is great. These are the only two loose springs that I've discovered within the entire blaster so far. This belongs to the mag release, which goes in really easily, you can even do that one-handed. The longer spring that came out is of course from the trigger. You can see the hexagonal shape there just moving around of the safety catch, which fits onto that piece of orange plastic just there. Now you might not be able to make this out very well on my camera, but this piece of plastic just down here is what catches against that piece of plastic there and prevents the trigger from being pulled when the safety is on. When you go to prime the blaster, this little orange tooth there makes its way down these ratchety steps until it reaches the end. When it reaches the end, it flicks down and then it ratchets back the other way, and the spring right there pulls the whole mechanism back. Whilst that's gone on, I'm going to pull it back to show you again. Whilst that's gone on, this plunger this tube at the front is being forced forwards by this pulley mechanism here. Which opens up a space for a ball to be inserted from the magazine. When that gets released, the entire pulley mechanism works the other way, and this tube gets put back into position to chamber the round. So I'm going to take my mag, that chamber gets opened up, and a Rival round gets pushed up. Then when you close it, that round is now chambered. Once this gets put back in place, there will be a pulley mechanism operating as well, which will pull this plunger head back. Plunger head gets caught right in there like that, and then when you pull the trigger, this guy here pushes that mechanism back up, allowing that to spring forwards, firing the Rival round out at high velocities. This safety mechanism here is held in the on or off position by this little piece of orange plastic there. And if I put the trigger where it would normally live, you can see that there's a piece of plastic just there which corresponds with the piece of plastic there on the safety mechanism. The safety mechanism is hexagonal and it fits over this corresponding hexagonal piece in the handle, which the switch is attached to. There's a protruding piece of plastic on the trigger which fits into this hole just there, and you also need to make sure you have the trigger spring in it, which is the longest spring of the two which will jump out at you from your blaster. I'm going to be honest, it actually all fits together really nicely. The difficult part, as always, is when you go to put the shells back together and trying to clip everything into place there. Now there is a little black hole here, now there is a corresponding little black protrusion on this part of the shell on the other side, which the corresponding piece of this arm is already in. I've now got to try and put that under there and over here without dislodging that, Any movement of the shell results in this jumping back out. This piece of metal here now slots under the jam door and should be able to catch on the trigger. Before I put the screws in, I need to get this piece here back to where it needs to be, and that makes me happy. We've still got a mag release, and we should still have a trigger as well. There's a relief. This bolt sled mechanism, thankfully, just kind of wheels in by itself. I'm going to need to lift this slightly, but it should just go back in. And that all sits quite comfortably back there where it should be. Like I said, compared to some blasters, this one is quite nice to take apart and put back together. There aren't bits that jump out all over the place at you. Now again, this incredibly beefy catch mechanism, slot in just about there again. So I've threaded the piece of metal around so it's kind of like that. Put it back in this slot, and I'm just kind of hoping that's right. I'm not going to be putting all of these back in, because I really just want to make sure that it's able to prime and fire before I go ahead and fully commit to closing the shell back up again. Well, the safety catch is working, and the jam door opens and closes. So I guess we're going to try it. In goes the mag. Close up the jam door. Let's insert that. And let's see if we're working. And we've gone all the way back, and for some reason we are not happy, so we're going to try and work out why we're not happy. Okay, so just now when I was reassembling this blaster, I made a critical schoolboy error. If you'd like to go back in the video and see if you can work out what it was, you can do. Go on. Go back, have a look. It was this. I'm afraid when I reinserted this just now, it was all the way down here. I forgot to put it back over the end of the plunger tube. And for that reason, the whole thing was only going part way back, and I had to open it up, and anyway, back together again now. And I put it all back together again. I have not put all the screws back in, because I'm not going to commit to closing the shell until after I've seen it working. Whoops, wrong way around. There we go. Mag release still works, which is nice. All the way prime, back again. Woo! Always a great feeling when it's working again. In terms of what it was like to open this blaster up, there weren't that many springs that jumped around all over the place and made my life difficult. Trigger spring, mag release spring were the only ones that I had to be a little bit careful of. Aside from that, it's just fine. I can see people potentially closing up the dead space on that plunger tube. I can see people potentially closing up the dead space on that plunger head. I can see people potentially taking the air restrictor out. Maybe a beefier spring, but like I say, you take your own risks. Rival gears have a reputation. I would just like to acknowledge that there is a little lock which is on the other side of the upper plate of the trigger, round about here in the blaster. I'm not sure whether it's related to the jam door or the priming mechanism or the mag. If anyone knows, then please let me know. I realised I forgot to fully investigate that when I had the blaster open. Thanks very much for watching. This is Justajolt signing off.